Well, thanks. Okay, thank you everybody for joining. This is the online lecture of the New Nationalism in America and Beyond. This is a debate on the book of that title, sponsored by a joint event sponsored by the LSE Ideas and the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism. If you'd like to know more about the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism, please do visit our website at asen.ac.uk or on ASEN events on social media. And LSE Ideas is on lse.ac.uk/ideas, or again, LSE Ideas on social media. The hashtag for this event is hashtag LSE New Nationalism. If you are joining on Zoom, please do ask your questions in the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, please put your questions in the chat and they will be passed to me to read out. And if you have technical issues, please do comment in the chat function on whatever platform you're on, and we will try to assist you. Last thing before I continue on to the talk, the next event that we're going to be hosting is a week from today with Professor Michael Hector on status reversal and his discontents. You can then find more information about that on asen.ac.uk/events. Okay, so now on to today's topic. We're going to be discussing the book by Robert Schertzer and Eric Taylor Woods called The New Nationalism in America and Beyond. What I'm going to do very briefly here as chair is to introduce the book, then introduce myself, and then introduce the speakers before I hand it over to the first speaker. So very briefly, this book is a discussion of why ethnic nationalism is gaining traction among white majorities of Western democracies. The focus of the book is largely on 3 countries, the social media campaign specifically of Donald Trump in the US, Marine Le Pen in France, and the Brexit campaign in the UK. And Schertzer and Woods show in these 3 examples how these new nationalists have been using older myths and symbols to construct an image of the nation as an ethnic community. And I think this book has relevance not just to political science, but also to sociology, history, and media studies. So by the way, I'm Elliott Green. I'm a professor of development studies at the London School of Economics. I'll be chairing this event. The reason I am chairing this is because I'm a member of the editorial board of the journal Nations and Nationalism. I'm going to introduce each speaker in the order in which they're going to speak. Our first speaker is going to be Philip Gorski. Philip Gorski is Frederick and Laura Goff Professor of Sociology and the chair of the Department of Sociology at Yale University. His work on state formation, nationalism, revolution, development, and religion focuses largely on modern and early modern Europe, and his more recent publications include American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present, published by Princeton University Press in 2019, and The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, with Samuel Perry, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Our second speaker is Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who's a professor in the School of Public Affairs and School of Education at American University, where she's also the director of research for the Center for University Excellence and the director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. She's a sociologist who's written or edited 6 books on nationalism, extremism, and higher education. Most recently, Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, published by Princeton University Press in 2020, and The Extreme Gone Mainstream, Commercialization and Far-Right Youth Culture in Germany, published by Princeton University Press in 2018. Our third speaker is Sophie Duchesne, who's the Director of Research at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique at the CNRS, and Director of the Centre Émile Durkheim, a joint research center of the CNRS, Sciences Po, and the University of Bordeaux. Her recent work on nationalism, citizenship, political identities in Europe has been published in such journals as the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative European Politics, Nations and Nationalism, and Perspectives on European Politics and Society. And she recently edited the French translation of Michael Billig's seminal book, Banal Nationalism. Then we will turn to the 2 authors of the book. First will be Robert Schertzer, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. His research and teaching are centered on federalism, judicial politics, and ethno-national diversity, with a particular interest in Canada. He's also the author of The Judicial Role in a Diverse Federation, Lessons from the Supreme Court of Canada, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2016, and articles in journals such as Nations and Nationalism, Ethnic and Racial Studies, the Canadian Journal of Political Science, Publius, and the International Journal of Constitutional Law. And our last speaker will be the other co-author of the book, Eric Taylor Woods, who is an associate professor in sociology in the School of Society and Culture at the University of Plymouth. He's also a faculty fellow at the Center for Cultural Sociology at Yale University, and previously taught at the University of East London. He's published research into politics, culture, and media, and the relationship with nationalism at journals such as Commonwealth and Comparative Politics, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Ethnicities, Nations and Nationalism, the International Journal of Politics, Culture, and Society, and the American Journal of Cultural Sociology. Okay, so now that I've introduced the speakers, I'm going to hand over first to Professor Gorski, Each of the three discussants will speak for roughly 10 minutes, and then we're going to have Robert and Eric respond for roughly 20 minutes before we turn to the audience for questions and answers. Okay, so without further ado, I'll turn now over to Professor Gorski.
Well, thanks to Elliott Green for the kind introduction, and thank you also to Robert and Eric for the book, which I enjoyed very much. I think it's fair to say that one of the most vexing and important academic and political questions of the moment is what we should make of Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, and other members of this nascent new right political tidal wave that seems to be sweeping across liberal democracies throughout the world. The usual answer to this question is populism. And I think that one way of understanding the book that Eric and Robert have produced is a way of answering a question that the populism literature raises but leaves unanswered. So, and that's a result of its avowed lack of cultural content. Populism, so the narrative goes, pits a pure people against a corrupt elite that is allied with an invading other and places its hopes in a messianic leader who will battle the elite, expel the invaders, and restore the people to their rightful place. But one of the central problems with such theories is that they do not tell us who the pure people are or where they came from. And this is where Schertzer and Wood are trying to fill in a very important gap. I would broadly frame theirs as a neo-Durkheimian theory of ethno-nationalism that is perhaps most directly indebted to the work of Anthony Smith and perhaps secondarily to that of my colleague at Yale, Jeffrey Alexander. So following Smith, they define nationalism as, quote, an ideological movement for attaining and maintaining autonomy, unity, and identity. And they argue that nationalist movements draw on myth-symbol complexes that define an in-group and an out-group, where myths are understood primarily as ethnic origin stories, and symbols are understood as their linguistic material or gestural manifestation. I think this is really the key theoretical contribution of the book, is reintroducing this idea of the myth-symbol complex and trying to specify a schema that we can use to study it in the three cases I consider and potentially in other cases as well, as they theorize that the myth-symbol complex has 5 elements: people, homeland, religion, history, and ethos. So myth-symbol complex identifies a dominant ethnic group. It delineates their geographical homeland. It connects them to a religious tradition, provides an account of their ethnogenesis, and enumerates characteristics that supposedly set them apart from other nations. So I'm going to sort of briefly comment on their treatment of the American case, which is the one that I know best. I don't think many people would argue with the claim that Trumpism can potentially be understood as a form of ethno-nationalism. And Schertzer would provide ample evidence for this reading in chapter 5, which is based in part on Trump's prolific tweeting during the 2016 presidential campaign. To me, the more original part of the case study comes in the previous chapter, chapter 4, where they apply their schema to American history from the colonial era through the present day, arguing that the molten core of the American myth-symbol complex is comprised of Anglo-Saxonism, agrarianism, Protestantism, and the idea of chosenness, of the United States as the chosen nation. Broadly speaking, I think their emphasis on ethnicity is in line with much recent scholarship. It's in line, for example, with the work of Bart Bonikowski and Paul DiMaggio, who have argued that that nationhood and nationalism, rather than populism and conservatism, are really the core of the contemporary Trumpian movement. And I think it's also in line with recent historical scholarship, which centers racial conflict in American history and emphasizes its place in American politics. Obviously, you can find a kind of a sampler and synthesis of a lot of this historiography in the 1619 project. But on closer inspection, my reading is that the synopsis is sometimes at odds with this recent work too. So, for example, I think the dominant view today is that the black-white racial binary was quite firmly in place in most of the United States, certainly here in South Carolina, where I'm sitting right now, by the late 17th century, and not at the time of the Revolution, as they argue. Similarly, I think it would be fair to say that Anglo-Saxonism was just one version of whiteness in American history, alongside a number of later entries, such as Nordic or Northern European. So white, in this sense, was hardly an uncontested and stable category. The emphasis on agrarianism can also be understood as political. You can certainly argue that Jefferson and his Democratic followers lionized the yeoman farmer. And it's also true that Southern planters and Midwestern farmers carried this tradition forward well into the 20th century, but always in opposition to a more urban and Hamiltonian vision of the United States as an urban and commercial civilization centered on the Eastern Seaboard, a tradition that lives on today in the coastal elitism and blue state producerism of the present moment. As for Protestantism, I think it's too blunt a category to really capture the complex and evolving relationship between religion and national identity in the United States. Religion intersected not only with race and ethnicity, but also with class and region. The high church and high class Protestantism of the colonial era denominations, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, and so on, was from the start very much at odds with and in conflict with the low church and low class Protestantism of the later missionary denominations, the Baptists and the Methodists in particular. There was a regional component too, insofar as liberal Congregationalists would cluster in the north, conservative Presbyterians in the south. And certainly since World War II, these mainline denominations have gradually ceded claims to controlling the culture to non-denominational evangelicals who've increasingly aligned themselves with conservative Catholics and pro-Israel Jews in the names of quote-unquote Judeo-Christian civilization. So I think that, again, that the great strength of their approach is it really adds cultural content to the pure people populist theories, but its great weakness is that it presumes a great deal of cultural unity and continuity, too much in my view. And this weakness is particularly in evidence in their reading of the American case, where ongoing immigration combines with vast territory to generate contestation and rupture. I don't think this is the weakness of their approach in particular, but rather of neo-Durkheimian approaches in general. And in this regard, my own view is that the work of Pierre Bourdieu provides a better starting point. I could say more about this, but I don't want to argue that the Durkheimian tradition is superseded by Bourdieu. There is still much to be learned, though, from another neglected strand of that tradition, the group that I would call the dark Durkheimians of the interwar era. I'm thinking of people like Roger Caillois and Georges Bataille. Indeed, their emphasis on the joys of violence and transgression and excess seem more relevant than ever to me. If there's anything that the new nationalism has taught us, it is that democratic politics is not an academic seminar where civil discourse is the norm and the better argument, prevails. As Schertzer was rightly pointed out, we are not that disenchanted and never have been. Myth, symbol, and ritual are just as important as ever. Our modernist secularist conceits, notwithstanding about this, Durkheim was right and Weber was wrong, all of which creates a dilemma for those of us who care about liberal democracy. The liberal gospel of individualism, rationality, and restraint leaves much to be desired, specifically some of our deepest desires for connection, elation, and liberation. In its heroic 19th century form, liberalism at least promised liberation from the ancient regime. In its stoic Cold War form, it could still promise protection from the horrors of totalitarianism. Those struggles have largely disappeared from our collective memory, but the desires have not. How to create a democratic form of social solidarity in an era of deep diversity without mimicking the dark Durkheimians of the far right, that, I think, is the political dilemma of our current age.
Well, thank you, Philip. That was wonderful and exactly on time. Amazing. I'm now going to turn over to Professor Miller-Idriss. And again, 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks for reorganizing this event. I know we had originally tried to organize it some time ago last year. And in fact, I'm glad in the end that we didn't, because I've been working on a book on gender and misogyny and the extreme right for the past year. And so I think my remarks actually are quite different now than they would have been back when we had originally started talking about this. So I'll say a little bit less about the book itself in the interest of saving time, but I do just want to say that I thought it was rigorous, thoughtful examination of the rise of ethnic nationalism, and that it did a really nice job of talking about the political mobilization of white majorities with these sort of defensive postures, but also explain the kind of broader and historical and cultural context. I think it was a big task. It's hard to do it. And ultimately, I really appreciated that the authors really remind us that nations are not just political, but also cultural projects, that these repertoires of myths and symbols that ethnic majorities are seeking to defend against perceived existential threats are primary and not just kind of window dressing. So if I had to quibble with anything in the book, I would say it's the relative lack of engagement on issues related to gender and the gendered mobilization of nationalist and extremist backlash, including violence, which I tend to work on. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about that and about what I might prompt us to think about that I think could have, there are lots of different things that could have been included in the book, but that's what I'm going to pick up on here. I do want to acknowledge that the book does address or mention at least issues of sexism among voters related to the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump presidential contest, and also talks about the femo-nationalism of Marine Le Pen and others who kind of position women's rights as Western in an existential battle against Islam and the kind of sexualized defensiveness of the nation. But those brief mentions aside, the excellent arguments in the book, I thought would benefit from more gendered framing. And so that's what I wanted to spend my time sort of introducing. So just to sum up a little bit about what we do know already about gender and nationalism and political violence, I'll just say that, scholars have spent decades painfully and painstakingly articulating a variety of ways that gender shapes radicalization to violence, mobilization, engagement in political extremism as it relates to nationalist, xenophobic projects, extremist movements, etc. And there's really three areas of very robust scholarship in this area where I think I would even call it a canon of kind of evidence and theory. One is on the nexus of gender and nationalism, including the rise of the populist radical right. The second is sort of on women's roles in these movements. And the third is on the role of masculinities, including toxic masculinity and kind of aggrieved masculinity in the recruitment and radicalization of men, especially to violence. So here we've seen a lot of work articulating how nationalist and extremist movements rely on and also exploit traditional gender hierarchies and norms that see women as the reproducers of the nation and men as its defenders. We've seen a lot of work, Kathleen Blee and others, showing that women's roles in extremist movements are complex, including in increasingly less backstage and more leadership positions, and are often but not always mobilized through their relationships with fathers, boyfriends, and husbands. And we've seen a lot of work tracing how ideals about femininity, motherhood, and conceptions of manhood along ascribed masculine qualities like bravery or courage, strength, determination, a willingness to be violent have clearly been linked to fascist, nationalist, and other extremist movements. We've seen even quite a bit of good analysis of that around things like the Oath Keepers, January 6th mobilization in the States, for example. So these insights have been well documented in contemporary research, but also in historical cases where there have been a lot of great case studies showing that there's a centrality to this sort of mix of chauvinistic nationalism, racist patriotism, and conceptions of manhood within Western colonialist and imperialist projects over the past 2 centuries. So it's intersectional. It's not that gender alone mobilizes ethnic and racist ideas of nationhood or exclusionary xenophobic ones, but neither do those work in many ways without the kind of natalist and reproductive insistence on white women's roles, for example, in reproducing the nation. There's been an expansive literature on gender and far-right populism more recently, especially across European cases, coming to similar conclusions as this historical work about the role of modern masculinity, and especially about the weaponization of women's and LGBTQ+ rights to frame immigrants and Muslims as a sexualized threat to Western values. This is the femo-nationalism that is talked about a bit in this book. So taken together, these strands of research have confirmed that ideas about femininity, masculinity, race, and nationalism are inextricably intertwined in the construction and maintenance of extremist, populist, and nationalist movements and violence. And that's the part that I would say is very well established, I think is generally traced quite well in the literature. And there's some sort of new work coming that I also wanted to mention, though, that I think is even more compelling for the purposes of this discussion, particularly around the case of Donald Trump. And here, this is recent and substantial quantitative evidence from multiple national, cross-national surveys, including in the US and the UK, that's demonstrated a clear predictive connection between hostile sexism, misogyny, support for political violence, and violent extremism. So here, what we're finding is that across a range of national contexts, hostile sexism and misogynist attitudes have emerged as significant and in some cases the biggest predictors of support for political violence and violent extremism. The relationship is substantial. I've seen now nationally representative survey data from just the last couple of years across 6 countries. In which hostile sexist attitudes are more important than religiosity, age, gender, level of education, and employment in predicting support for violent extremism. It also plays a role in support for populist and far-right political candidates, which is more to the point of this book. So hostile sexism, for example, is a more important predictor of favorable attitudes toward Trump than religiosity, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, education, age, marital status, or income. In the UK, a recent national representative survey research shows that misogyny predicts men's violent extremist intentions, their willingness to engage in interpersonal violence, and their support for violence against women and girls. So not just related to populism itself, but a wider range of violence. Across ideological and geographic cases, in other words, beliefs that justify and defend the superiority of men and the unequal distribution of economic, social, or political power between men and women are foundational and consequential for support for populism, for support for populist candidates, for political violence and violent extremism, and the pathways that lead to these outcomes. So both quantitative and qualitative evidence, both historical and contemporary cases, therefore suggest that gender and its intersections with racism and other forms of hate and exclusion should be among the very first factors we consider in understanding nationalist violence, mobilization, and extremist motivations. Misogynist and sexist attitudes are foundational to these, as a gateway, as an opening to later radicalization, as a red flag or warning sign, and as an ideology that motivates kind of on their own. And the last thing I'll say is that, just because it relates so well to the discussion we've just been having from Phil and also in the book itself, is that there's good discussion of this already in discussions of why American voters rallied around Donald Trump, for example, even after he was caught on tape talking about grabbing women's private parts without their consent. So the argument I've made previously on this and continue to make is that American voters didn't rally around him despite his hypermasculine and heteronormative bluster, but rather because of it. And that's an argument that's been made elsewhere by scholars as well. This is also, and getting into Phil Gorski's expertise here, it was true for evangelicals, of course, where there's been a lot of discussion about support for Trump as it relates to what Kristen Duchesne calls militant masculinity, an ideology that enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power. But it was also true for voters outside that community as well. And I'll just end then by saying, that in many ways he was elected because he was the kind of real man whose rugged masculinity reminded many white voters of a time in America when sort of all was right in the world, or with the world, as Duchesne puts it. So I will end there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much for your time, and hopefully I didn't go too much over.
Thank you. You were about 2 seconds over. Fantastic. Again, thank you for that. That was a really interesting contribution. I'm going to now turn to Professor Duchesne. Again, our third and last discussant before we head to Robert and Eric. So, Professor Duchesne, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Elliott, and many thanks to the ASEN organizers for inviting me again to this debate. I consider myself a public supporter of Billig's banal nationalism, and as such, I have obvious disagreements with the central thesis of Robert Schertzer and Eric Taylor Wood's book. And in fact, I assume that this is a reason why I was invited to this debate. So I will start by summarizing how I understand the book. I will then discuss the ways the authors demonstrate their thesis. And finally, I will point out how I'm afraid the book might contribute to promoting the naturalization of nationalism. This is the contrary of what Billig tried to explain. So first, my understanding of the book. The main argument of the book is based on a comparative analysis of Twitter posts produced during the respective election campaigns of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and the Brexit promoters. The content of these Twitter posts is analyzed in the context of historical synthesis of the myths and symbols that have developed over the long term in these three countries and are at the core of their ethnic nationalism. The authors highlight the representation of the populations that were dominant at the time of the national construction, the way these groups were conceived as the legitimate people and the rightful owners of their countries. They describe the persistence of this representation rooted in these white people's belief in their moral and religious superiority and even their genetic superiority. They also show these groups' characteristics adapted over time. In this respect, Robert and Eric underline the strong rejection of Islam and Muslims in the recent period, as well as the way liberalism has been included in the so-called ethnic characteristic of these white majorities of the West. The analysis of the tweet shows that during the three campaigns mentioned, Trump, Le Pen, and the Leave leaders are very much the vehicles for these representations. As the authors put it, they tapped into long-standing myths and symbols. So let me summarize the main thesis of the book in this way. The ethnic nationalism of the majority population of Western countries, that is, the white populations, is deeply rooted in their history. It is therefore an integral part of the identity of this nation, hence the identity aspiration of this population must be taken seriously. As I see it, the demonstration of Robert and Eric provide for this thesis suffers from two main weaknesses, the construction of the key person and the nature of the explanation. So first, the construction of the research puzzle. The author's objective is to help us understand the rise of ethnic nationalism in countries that embrace civic nationalism, as the UK, the US, and France all do. They postulate that in such countries, observers were under the false impression that ethnic nationalism has disappeared, almost. They show that it has been around for centuries and that it's still here in the digital age, and presents this as a proof, not only that this nationalism has deep roots, meaning that it's not invented, but also that it is ultimately a matter of identity, which I think means something that cannot be argued with. As the author recalled, many observers and scholars interested in nationalism has taken a stand against the opposition between civic and ethnic nationalisms because they consider that this distinction does not allow for the observation of the profound interconnectedness between the different registers of national preference. But this does not mean that they do not acknowledge the persistence of what Robert and Eric call ethnic nationalism. To focus on the French case, which I know better, I think that the presence of Marine Le Pen in the second round of the presidential election, I don't think it came as a surprise to many scholars. Indeed, scholars have been observing the rise of the hot nationalism in France and Europe for years and did not suddenly notice it in 2016. According to Billig's banal nationalism, in order to understand the omnipresence of nationalism, it is necessary to look at all its manifestation and not just at its most vehement forms, for the soft or cold forms that we maintain and value are only the other side of the coin and prepare the ground for new, more visible outpourings. In other words, there is no difference in nature between Le Pen's hot nationalism and Macron's patriotism, only a difference of temperature. Both, like all politicians, naturalize the division of the world into nations, a division which has been the source of legitimacy for rulers on a world scale since the founding of nations. After the Second World War, the atrocities of the Holocaust and the hopes raised by post-war reconstruction and decolonization for a time moderated or cooled nationalism, but it remains there, maintained by the multiplicity of flaggings, hardly visible but omnipresent. Visually and verbally, citizens are constantly reminded that they are national. This constant reminders construct a representation of the world that essentializes the nation and makes it look natural, even though, as historians have shown, it is just one historical form of government that emerged at a particular period of human history, a period in which good as well as bad things have happened. This representation of the world, this ideology, has ended up becoming a universal one, with formerly colonized countries not lagging behind in terms of nationalism, even though they are the objective losers of a deeply ontologically unequal and violent international system. Robert and Eric are right to consider that the pervasiveness of nationalism today is probably not analyzed seriously enough. Their book has the advantage of pointing out the atrocities and lies that nationalism maintains, but I think they are wrong in trying to explain its omnipotence by the depths of its roots. So I'm moving on to my second point. I really don't see how showing that the Twitter posts of our leaders carry nationalist and racist representation, which have been part of ideological repertoires for centuries, proves that ethnic nationalism is a matter of identity, but maybe our understanding of identity differ. I leave it up to the historians who defend an ethno-symbolist conception of the genesis of nation to comment on the historical synthesis proposed by the authors, who bring together ideas expressed centuries apart, as if this proved that they were indeed long-standing myth, symbol, and hence identity. Indeed, the 3 chapters devoted to the ways in which these tweets draw on the ideological repertoires of white nationalism are reminiscent of the standardized nature of the ideological repertoires that accompanied the birth of a nation, and which contrasts with the claim to uniqueness and, in this case, to the claim to superiority of the people. As for me, I don't see identities at work here, but ideology. Robert and Eric are right. It's not enough to want people to stop being nationalists for them to refrain from it. But it seems to me that our job as social scientists is to analyze the forces and practices that continue to feed nationalism and to do our best to avoid naturalizing it further. The authors indicate several times that they do not question the modernity of nations and therefore the historicity of nationalism. But the demonstrations they propose does have the effect, at least on me, be it voluntary or not, of essentializing nationalism anew. All the more so because the book is nicely written and easy to read. From my point of view, it will contribute directly to the reinforcement of nationalism and its naturalization, rather than to a better understanding of it, as the authors claim they want to do. Helping to sustain nationalism today, especially in its most aggressive, unjust form, white ethnic nationalism, seem to me particularly serious in the current context of the proliferation of wars and the climate crisis. The nation is a historically situated system of world government. In the past, it has fostered the development of capitalism, democracy, and a form of national wealth sharing through public services and the welfare state. Today, that is no longer the case. Dominant economic forces are now largely playing out on the supranational level. Inequalities and wars, along with the increasing number of climate-related disasters, are forcing millions of people to seek refuge elsewhere, where they are labeled as outsiders and badly, if not awfully, treated as such. A nationalism ethnic and civic, hot and banal, because it legitimates national preference, America first, les Français d'abord, makes it impossible to find ways out of these catastrophes. If proofs were needed, the certainty that the national model is outdated can be found in the urgency of the climate transition and the impossibility of addressing its implications, contribute to the renaturalization of nationalism instead of seeking to really explain it. I'm finished.
Thank you, Professor Duchesne. Exactly on time as well. 3 in a row. Fantastic. Okay, so let's now move over to, do you want to do 10 minutes each? Is that how you like to do that? Something like that?
I think
Robert?
I'll probably talk a bit, then Eric will talk, and then I'll just wrap up for 2 minutes.
Okay, let me just do 20 minutes.
Yeah, we'll take that extra 2 minutes from everybody else. And
okay, 20 minutes in total. All right, fantastic. So first, again, thanks again to our 3 speakers, and now we're going to go to the 2 co-authors of the book. We'll start with Robert Schertzer. So Robert, over to you, please.
Thanks, Elliott. So first, let me just start by thanking our 3 commentators for their generosity and engagement with our book. It's like truly an honor when colleagues take the time to read and comment on your work. We all know how much effort this is, right? And we cannot thank you enough for doing this. It's humbling, even when people don't really agree with you, right? To have people participate in an event like this. I actually think personally even more humbling when they take their role so seriously and they point out, where your argument analysis could be improved. So truly, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to start by just saying a few words about the book, because I also have no illusions that the people listening have read it, right? And so I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, but also because it's going to foreground a few points about how Eric and I want to respond to each and every one of you. So when Eric and I started writing our book, we were seized with a pretty straightforward puzzle, I think. We really wanted to know, how is it that Donald Trump, this billionaire New Yorker who had never engaged with issues associated with poor, white, rural Americans, how was he able to garner their widespread support? And when we were thinking about this, we looked further afield. We were similarly puzzled by the stunning vote for Brexit, the historic showing for Le Pen in France in 2017. And as Sophie just said, we were well aware, right, that far-right parties and populists have been making steady gains, particularly in Europe, for decades. And this is well known. There's tons of work on this. But something felt different about 2016 and 2017. There was like a clear and puzzling moment where anti-immigrant, anti-pluralist, anti-liberal nationalists were succeeding in some of the world's most stable, plural liberal democracies. So we looked at this and we did what academics do. We wrote a book, right? One that was specifically trying to understand the how and the why of this new nationalism. And we did this knowing that a ton of ink and a ton of airtime has already been dedicated to trying to understand this rising nationalism. Most of it's focused on the populist bend of these movements, as Phil was saying, drawing attention to really big shifts like economic inequality, migration, backlashes to liberalization, rise of social media, and so on. But when we looked through this work, we noticed a real tendency to downplay the role of nationalism. Since we're scholars of nationalism, we couldn't let that stand. So in our book, we really tried to do 2 things. First was to trace the power of what we saw as specifically ethnic nationalism as a force in the politics of the West. But second, it was a deeper issue of trying to showcase the potential for ethno-symbolism as an explanatory framework to really help us understand the dynamics of politics today. To achieve these goals, what we did is essentially systematized ethno-symbolism as a social scientific framework seeking to explain politics, and really to help us understand the resurgence of ethnic nationalism because of its ability to highlight the role of culture, ethnicity, and history. In essence, the book in its total traces the origins and maps the development of the core cultural content for the white majorities in the US, the UK, and France, And then it examines how this content was used in the 2016 US election, the Brexit campaign, and the 2017 French presidential campaign. So when we talk about the book, Eric and I always like to say it has two empirical sides to its coin. The first is about identifying the emergence and crystallization of this core myth symbol complex for an ethnic conception of the American, British, and French nations. And the other side of the coin is about trying to explain and examine how Trump, the Leave campaigners, and Le Pen used this cultural content, how it structured their political communication, and how they relied on ethnic myths and symbols to cultivate support, particularly from aggrieved members of the white majority. Now, in our discussion and comments, there's been a lot of focus on the theoretical element, and Eric's going to talk more about that, but I want to spend 2 minutes on the second part of the empirical coin, right? The empirical analysis of Twitter. So what we did in the book, in essence, was we applied our schema of ethnic myths and symbols to analyze the political communication of Trump, Leavers, and Le Pen by focusing on their Twitter communication. All told, we examined 15,000 tweets in the book. For clarity, this is every single tweet that Donald Trump sent during the 2016 campaign, as well as those sent by the Leave campaigners during Brexit and Le Pen during her 2017 presidential run. To our knowledge, this is still the most comprehensive analysis of the Twitter communication of these leaders and movements to date. And the reason I'm singling this out is because it breaks with approaches in much of the work on today on political communication. I think as everyone knows, right, the norm today is to use computers, computational social science methods to code huge swaths of data using generative AI or large language models, or looking at a very small number of pieces of text very in depth with human eyes. Eric and I tried to kind of balance this and hit the middle ground. We had a breadth of analysis. We looked at every single tweet in our corpus of text, but we actually provided depth by individually and personally reading every single tweet with at least 2 human coders, always including ourselves. And we've come to call this, with a tongue firmly in cheek, brute force qualitative content analysis of trying to hit both of these balances from a breadth and a depth of analysis. The reason I'm talking about this is because we think this method is what allowed us to identify whether ethnic myths and symbols that were established centuries earlier were actually structuring and manifesting themselves in the political communication of leaders today. And so unsurprisingly, since we wrote a book about it and we were debating it, we found these myths in people's tweets. And we didn't just find like a few. We didn't find a myth here and a symbol there, which is kind of what we expected, to be honest. We found that ethnic nationalism was the most common theme in each of the 3 social media campaigns. Ethnic nationalism was the defining feature of Trump's campaign in 2016, of the Leave campaigns and Le Pen's campaign. Now, I clearly don't have time. I can see Elliott already staring at me. We don't have time to go into these findings, right, in detail, right? I'll say it once during the whole debate. If you want to know more, you should buy the book, right? But just to give a quick flavor, just so people have an understanding of what we're talking about here, I'll talk about the US for 1 second. So in the US, what we found was that Trump very fastidiously drew from the long-established myths and symbols that defined the true members of the American nation as white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and rural. He tapped into these ideas to build an in-group around notions that real Americans were white, Christian, European, and they lived in the rural heartland. He then framed this majority as threatened by a collection of invading outsiders. Namely, he called dangerous illegal Hispanic migrants, Islamic terrorists, and globalist elites. And he tied this all together. His entire campaign in 2016 was essentially anchored by an argument that he could protect the white majority from the threat of these outsiders and return them to their rightful place of dominance in order to make America great again for the white majority, for his silent majority, his movement, his forgotten men and women. And in a very similar vein, we showed how Marine Le Pen tapped into the deep, sometimes hidden cultural roots of ethnic nationalism in France, and how in the UK, the Leave campaigners tapped into the wellspring of ethnic myths and symbols associated with English nationalism to make their case for Brexit. And we can talk more about this if people want in question and answers. But in essence, what we did in the book is try to find these myths and symbols in today's political communication. And what we saw was that in the face of perceived threats of the dominant white majority, whether these threats were instigated by economic, cultural, perceived demographic, or perceived loss of control over the state in the face of globalization, Trump, Leavers, and Le Pen reached back into history to draw from ethnic myth symbol complexes to target members of the white majorities by speaking to them in code. And they communicated these codes through digital media, mobilizing huge swaths of the white majority as a movement to defend an ethnic notion of the nation. In this respect, the ethnic nationalism of Trump, the Leavers, and Le Pen all displayed continuity with core elements of the ethnic myth symbol complex that were established early in the development of their nations, But as we talk about in detail, they updated the reference for the in and out group to reflect changing social political conditions. And this is the entire basis of the argument of the book for Eric and I, that the new nationalism isn't new, it's just the most recent iteration of a long-standing and long-running process. Okay, I will be quiet for a bit and let Eric now actually turn and talk a little more about our theory and approach and respond more directly to some of our comments.
Okay, thank you, Rob. And I'll just to begin, I want to also echo what Robert was saying earlier with his expression of thanks, just to also thank you, all three of you, Professor Miller-Idriss, Professor Duchesne, and Professor Gorski, for taking the time to read our book and to participate in this seminar. I can't thank you enough. It's truly an honor. And I've got to say, looking at all your criticisms together, for Rob and I, we feel that you've in part delivered something of a masterclass in how to level a critique in such a way that it provokes a constructive dialogue rather than shutting down debate. And so we really appreciate your thoughtful interventions, even if in different ways you don't entirely agree with our thesis. Now, to turn to our responses, I'll begin with Professor Gorski. And in my reply, of course, we can't hit on every point, and we'll try to draw out what we thought is the kind of most significant critique from each of you. So turning to Professor Gorski's critique, he's mainly directed at our analytical framework. And for Professor Gorski, we feel that this, as he expressed it, the strength of our book is also our weakness. And that's to say that he approves of our efforts to expose longstanding and persistent strand of ethnic nationalism in these three so-called civic nations of the West. But in doing so, he suggests that we've been overzealous in our argument. And it's here that Gorski argues that we have been overly emphasized the historical persistence of ethnic nationalist conceptions of nationhood. And in so doing, we've downplayed instances of discontinuity and segmentation. And according to Gorski, this is due to an inbuilt flaw in our approach, which he traces to our grounding in taking up the legacy of Durkheim's elementary forms. So in my reply, or in our reply, I want to return a little bit in the design of our analytical framework, because indeed, when we were thinking through our analytical framework and reflecting on what we were finding through our cases, in fact, we sought to anticipate this criticism that Gorski has leveled at our book. And in so doing, we hoped in designing our analytical framework that our framework would be able to account for not just continuity, but also cultural change. And for us, we find that cultural change occurs through two main processes, through contestation and through adaptation. And so returning to all three of our cases, we found that each of our cases are marked by a reoccurring conflict between the forces of ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. And indeed, through history, there tends to be an oscillation between these two sides. And just to talk very briefly about the 20th century in an American context, so what we have is a kind of rapid rise of the civic nationalist tradition following the 1960s, but that's been increasingly countered by an ethnic nationalism that's been gaining ground ever more rapidly in the past couple of decades. And if we trace that back over several centuries, we can see that oscillation occur. So there's change that occurs as a result of contestation, but there's also change that occurs within these contesting traditions. And here, because we're focusing on the ethnic nationalist tradition, we find that what occurs is that we have a process of adaptation. So rather than wholly new myths and symbols created, what we have is that existing ones are adapted within political communication. So if we return to the American example, probably the most famous example is the shifting emphasis from in definitions of ethnic definitions of peoplehood that are based around Anglo-Saxonism and Protestantism, which begin to get replaced by broader signifiers of whiteness and Christianity. And this largely reflects the ongoing incorporation in the late 20th century of Eastern and Central and Southern Europeans, as well as Catholic Europeans, into what was formerly the British dominant core. Okay, so that's how we tried to account for change. But as Rob said, despite our best efforts to kind of establish guardrails against overemphasizing continuity, what we did find is that there is significant continuity through time, and there is remarkable continuity of content of ethnic nationalism across our three cases. And as Rob just explained, this foundational set of ethnic myths and symbols that define the nation and its boundaries are indeed being used and updated today by today's new nationalists. Now, I want to make a final point on responding to Gorski about his very interesting commentary on the so-called dark Durkheimians, who focused on a kind of sociology of evil, and particularly Georges Bataille. Now, it could be, and through the discussion, it might find out that we have not properly understood Gorski's point here. But in reflecting on this, I do not necessarily see a conflict between Bataille's theorizing and our own work. Now, Bataille, as I understand him, suggested that evil was central to the maintenance of moral communities because it provides the antithesis of the good. Now, if we reflect on this from the perspective of nationalism, we might think that the good is everything that draws us together and maintains boundaries with the outside. And in that respect, evil is therefore the things that pull us apart. And we can think that the worst type of evil is probably the mass killing of our people or attempts at genocide of our people. Now, national communities remember their experiences of suffering evil through collective rituals. And these rituals, as we know, can unleash powerful feelings of hatred and violence of the perceived perpetrators of that evil. And there's history is replete with this kind of hatred and violence, which is unleashed against enemy others and, of course, against enemies within. And so thinking about this, I don't necessarily see a conflict with our approach. In fact, I think if anything, if we think about Durkheim's legacy in that sense, I think it further underlines our need to take culture seriously in the analysis of ethnic nationalism. So, as I said, just a very brief reply into what was a very full-throated criticism, but I'm going to turn now to Professor Miller-Idriss's also very thoughtful criticism of our work. Now, Professor Miller-Idriss is less concerned with our analytic framework, and she indicates a kind of general agreement with our thesis, but her thoughtful commentary is rightfully critical of what we examined, or rather what we failed to include. And here, Miller-Idriss raises the important point that our book does not consider the seminal role of gender in the new nationalism. And as Miller-Idriss points out, there is now a large and impressive body of empirical research that demonstrates that gender is absolutely central to understanding the rise and consequences of the new nationalism. And on this point, we can only humbly agree. Miller-Idriss is right that gender is not a central focus of our book. But we also want to be clear that we do think and we do agree with Miller-Idriss that studying gender is absolutely central to understanding the new nationalism. And our rationale for not focusing on gender, I must admit, was based on more mundane considerations related to our research design. And that's because the new nationalism is really inherently multifaceted, and there are many angles from which to approach its study. And early in our research, we decided to focus on one of the most glaring gaps in works of the new nationalism. And this was the significance of historically constituted ethnocultural content in the political communication of the new nationalism, specifically as it related to, as Rob mentioned, people, homeland, religion, history, and ethos. Now, we debated early on whether we should include gender as one of these references, but we decided that gender was simply too significant to be subsumed under the analytical category of ethnic nationalism and then simply added on as a potential referent. We thought that to take gender seriously, we needed a wholly separate category of analysis, and simply in our view, it was beyond the scope of this project. But definitely, it's we hope in the works going forward. And in that respect, I just want to finish my reply to Professor Miller-Idriss to talk about how we've been thinking about how gender might be incorporated, because we do think that our approach to studying the new nationalism can contribute in some small way to research on the role of gender. And here we think that adopting an analytical lens that considers how historically constituted conceptions of gender are playing into the political messaging of nationalist leaders can help us to better understand how and why they're cultivating support from target populations. And we think that such an approach could help to explain the often subtle, but in our view, significant differences across time and space in the meanings that nationalist leaders associate with gender. And just kind of, there's many examples that could showcase this variation, but we were discussing amongst each other, and we're thinking here of differences in how conceptions of femininity are used by ethnic nationalists as cultural boundary markers in the US and France. So the French right under Le Pen has taken up and ethnicized the Republican myth that the French nation is the home of liberal conceptions of femininity, largely to construct a boundary with seemingly illiberal others, particularly Muslims. Now, this interestingly contrasts with how ethnic nationalists in the US are employing gender to cultivate support. Here we see femininity is increasingly associated with the so-called trad wife phenomenon, which combines whiteness and Christianity with a domesticized and rural ideal of traditional conceptions of the woman's role in the nuclear family. And of course, we saw that on full display in the Republican reply to Biden's address just 2 weeks ago. So immediately, this is a very broad brush comparison, and this could not hold up to sustained analysis, but I think it should at the very least serve to illustrate our points that a close analysis that takes into account the role of institutionalized conceptions of gender could yield new insights about the new nationalism. And on that, I'll pass the torch back to my co-author, Robert, who can finish our reply. So thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Elliott, I'm just going to beg 2 minutes, if that's okay. So thanks very much. Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to finish with a few words in response, particularly to Professor Duchesne. So again, we just want to start by saying merci pour votre commentaire. Okay, they're really, really helpful on our book. They've actually pushed Eric and I to think quite a bit about our approach and how it relates to your points. And much, I think, of what we opened up with here and what Eric said already has touched on elements of your points, Professor Duchesne. But we just want to talk in particular about kind of 2 points you've raised. And both of these points relate, I think, to like an underlying disagreement, which you intimated at, over how we approach the study of nationalism and the role of social scientists in this enterprise. So the first issue here is our reliance on the civic-ethnic divide to understand nationalism. Professor Duchesne's criticism uses a common refrain that we've heard before, right? Identifying forms of civic or ethnic nationalism is essentially tracking a distinction without a difference. That doing so obscures both the pervasiveness of nationalism as well as how its varying forms overlap. And while there is, of course, truth to this perspective, right, we're well aware of this critique and the associated long line of criticism about classifying nations or nationalism as civic or ethnic. Truthfully, when Eric and I started the book, we did not start with a conception of ethnic nationalism as our registrar. That is, this was something that came out of our discussion and exploration of what was going on. And in so doing, we consciously tried to take these criticisms and critiques of the civic-ethnic divide into account when we devised our framework. We explicitly used the concept of civic and ethnic nationalism as ideal types, which we used to examine national conflicts that occurred within our national case studies. In essence, we were tracing one of the ways nationalism manifests within a nation. And we didn't trace, admittedly, the entire gambit of forms of nationalism in our cases. We didn't map the civic-ethnic symbol complexes and how it was employed in the campaigns or in the histories of our cases. This is not to say we couldn't have done this. Indeed, we have done this in our most recent article in Political Communication. We've examined how Biden has used more civic, liberal conceptions of nationalism and Trump used more ethnic and illiberal conceptions of nationalism in the 2020 campaign. But in the book, we were interested in looking at the undercurrent of this resurgent ethnic form of nationalism. While doing so, we tried to be clear, right? Perhaps we didn't clear enough, that this ethnic nationalism sits alongside, it overlaps with, it reinterprets, it competes with other forms of nationalism that elites draw upon in order to reconstruct conceptions of the nation. But the second, I think, and more serious point that you've raised, Professor Duchesne, is that when Eric and I are undertaking our research, that we're naturalizing ethnic nationalism by studying its historical, cultural, and ideological roots. As we understand your comments, Professor Duchesne, that they stem from a place that you're weary of any approach to studying nationalism that risks naturalizing it. What we can say here is we strongly, strongly agree. Scholars of nationalism really need to strive to avoid naturalizing culture. But it seems that for you, Professor Duchesne, at least as we understand your critique, this perspective means we should reject any analytical approach that sees culture having a relatively independent social force in the development and mobilization of nationalism. In short, because nationalists frame their movements as a defense of their culture, we should spend our time deconstructing these claims and rejecting them. While we agree that there needs to be lots of caution when studying nationalism, we strongly disagree that a fear of naturalizing nationalism precludes prioritizing culture as an object of analysis. And here we're not alone, right? There is a lot of research in history and sociology and political science which is refuting the conventional view that Gellner proposed that culture is a false consciousness that is hardly worth analyzing. And we think the literatures demonstrate how culture, much like other social forces, plays a pretty key role in driving the continuity and change in political systems. So in our view, we can't ignore these dynamics, right, as social scientists. Our job is to construct a methodology that imposes guardrails, as Eric was talking about, against this naturalization that can come with studying these dynamics. And this is what we tried to do in the book. This was our intention. And here we want to be really clear, right? So ethnic nationalism is a malign force in the politics of the West. But our normative position on the dangers of it and the needs to defeat its hold in our politics shouldn't get in the way of studying the drivers of its support. We may wish it gone, we may wish people would turn away from it, but telling people not to be nationalists simply isn't going to work. And we know this because our book shows that this ethnic nationalism has an immense staying power and immense effective power. And this power comes, at least Eric and I think, in part from the historically constituted and widely institutionalized myths and symbols that set out and make an argument for who was a member of the nation and who was not. And these long-standing myths and symbols we don't think can be eradicated only through structural factors, right? We think that you need to tackle them head on, you have to uncover their basis and interrogate their role in our politics. And we make this case in a way inspired by and seeking to contribute back to the long line of research on whiteness, particularly in the US, which has demonstrated how conceptions of white supremacy have remained really firmly embedded in American culture long after the civil rights movement. Indeed, we actually see our book as contributing to this line of research by showing how it's these early ideas about the ethnic nature of a nation became institutionalized and carried through time and thus played a role by elites largely in the construction of its culture. So I think I'll stop there because I can see Elliott scowling at me. Okay, but thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I wasn't scowling. I was smiling. But thank you again to all five of you for your contributions. I think we have now time to open it up to Q&A. So what I'm going to do is there's so far 2 questions, and I'm going to read each of them and then have, I guess we'll allow any of the 5 of you to respond to that if you'd like to. So first, this is from Carlin. It says, thank you very much for your engagement. I focus on the intersection of war studies and far-right extremism. I was wondering if there was any commentary on the ways these currents, particularly nationalism and its myths and symbols, informs and influences civil-military relations, as well as the way the military as an institution self-conceives. Who would like to tackle that?
I'll tackle it, but I in no ways can at all pretend to be an expert on military-civil relations and the role of the military in the instantiation of ideas of around the nation. But I can conjecture that militaries are key institutional carriers of the kinds of myths and symbols that Robert and I are talking about. Military academies are not the place where myths and symbols are, created unconsciously through banal means, the kind of processes that Professor Duchesne is talking about. This is quite explicit, I imagine, in military training, in talking about the grandeur of the nation and the people around the nation. But On the other hand, we know from lots of research that militaries are also great integrators in a sense. We can see in military civil relations in the US that there has tended to be a conflict recently amongst the so-called new ethno-nationalist populists and some military leaders. And that was playing out in the Senate very recently, where certain ideas around also gender, sexuality, race, in fact, some of the more kind of progressive occurrences in American society start in the military first and then broaden out. And we've seen books on how returning, for example, soldiers of color from the Second World War return to the American context to find themselves shocked to be still experiencing widely institutionalized forms of white supremacy after fighting on behalf of the nation, or as it's perceived. And so there's probably two things going on there. At the risk of speaking for too long, I'm also thinking, I'm just anecdotally remembering in reports in both France and Germany that far-right movements draw a lot of support from former soldiers. And I'm thinking, I read this fabulous book by Ron Eierman, one of former colleagues of Phil Gorski, on making of white American identity. And many of the leaders, he doesn't really go in depth, but you can kind of track the far-right leaders in the second half of the 20th century were vets of the Vietnam War. And so there's a kind of linkage there, but there's a kind of cross purposes going on there. So I'll cede it there, but there's a lot of interesting there in that question. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Would anybody else like to respond, or should I can go to the second question?
Maybe I would just add very quickly two other points about it. I agree with everything Aaron said, but also would say, at least in the U.S. context, not just the kind of returning Vietnam vets, which played a huge role, but veterans in general, I think we've seen are targeted with rhetoric from groups that are using some of these same myths and ideals about the Constitution, for example. So there's a lot there around the veteran community. And then the second thing that hasn't really come up yet, but I think in the US, you can't really understand some of what's happening related to this without understanding gun culture and how much gun culture is also kind of integrated into ideas about manhood and masculinity as it relates to defense of the nation, and but also to ideas and propaganda that circulates wildly that says, including now in elected officials' official campaign speeches and advertising, that you should have a gun to keep yourself safe from overreach by the government, right? So this kind of anti-government ideology, we just saw that in Pennsylvania in campaigning for Mehmet Oz, who used to be anti-gun or pro-gun control, one might say. And I just saw the ad that he ran, in the last cycle that was saying exactly that you might need a gun to keep yourself safe from government overreach. And we found in our national survey data that it was 7.3% of people aged 14 to 30 in the US think they need a gun for that reason. So, all of that's a big toxic stew, but I think that has a lot to do with war culture, if you will, and military culture and defense, in addition to, to the ways that it might be pretty specific to the US.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm now going to turn to the second question. I see, after the second question, I see one that Anna Elizabeth has raised her hand, and I also see a question from Rachel. So I'll do that in those order. The second question that I've seen is from Jeffrey, and I'm going to read that out. It says, it is true that Trump won, but he did not win the popular vote. Leave won, only in England, largely by under 21s not voting. So really, how powerful are the appeals to ethnic nationalism? As time moves on and demography changes, white nationalists will age and die off. Will the ethno-nationalists be able to continue to make their appeal, or has their moment passed? Am I too complacent? So I'll hand that over to whoever wants to tackle that one.
Okay, yeah, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, Philip.
I'll just say something very quickly. Demography is not destiny. This is one of the greatest illusions of the progressive left in the world today.
Thank you. Thank you. Robert, you wanted to add to that.
How do I compete with that? He said in 4 words, what is so no, but I think that that's exactly right. I was going to talk about notions of whiteness a little bit and how demographic shifts have long happened, right? And part of Eric and I were trying to show is that there's adaptability in these core mythosymbolic frameworks, right? And how they actually drive support for these kind of movements. What I would say is, I get this question a lot, right? When Eric and I talk about the book, I think if Trump loses in 2016, if Brexit doesn't happen, we still write the book. It's still a success, right? Huge swaths of people voted for Donald Trump, despite the fact that he campaigned on, misogynistic, racist, ethnic nationalist terms. In 2020, vote share went up. It got 74 million votes when you could not know more about the man if you tried, right? And the same thing, Le Pen, we talk about Le Pen as Le Pen didn't win, right? In 2017, clearly finished second. In 2022, didn't win. Is currently polling above Macron in some polls in France, but it's a success because the point being here is that they're legitimating elements of their movement, turning the Overton window, expanding it, making their claims seem more legitimate, and expanding support. And that's a success by any measure, right? From their eyes, it's a dire turn in our politics. But the point here being that we shouldn't be complacent just because we're talking about very small margins, right? About people supporting or not supporting. So here it's about this element in rhetoric emerging in our politics and not immediately being shouted down. That is a measure of success that shows the staying power and effective power of these kinds of arguments. I don't know if I'm making sense, Eric, in terms of what our argument is, but that's largely how I see that kind of success element.
Just to add to that point, Robert, it's quite striking when we started the work and we just look at polling data, which might be more familiar with people who had long studied the American scene, but Trump, as the Republican Party does, and of course there's been lots of work showing that nationalist polarization has largely come to inhabit the bifurcation between the Republican and Democratic Party, such that the Republican Party largely represents an ethno-nationalist movement now, and it attracts majority of white voting Americans. Even though much is made about Trump's ability to attract people of color, it's largely his core support is coming from white Americans. And so that's to respond to the point that perhaps he wasn't a success, perhaps he didn't get that, but he's a success amongst white people.
Sorry. Great. Thank you. I'm going to turn to a question which came in from the ASEN chat from Rachel, and then I will turn to Anne Elizabeth and Miriam. This is a question from Rachel, but it's actually a question I was going to raise as well, but I think Rachel's probably put it better, which is, thank you for the fascinating discussion. The 3 case studies are from the West. Can the same analysis be extended beyond, particularly to Mr. Modi in India?
Yes, I think that this actually, well, I guess it would depend on your, perspective on the utility. Professor Duchesne may not agree, and Professor Gorski may have take some issue with some of the things that we're about to say. But I think part of what we were trying to do when Eric and I started this project was specifically to develop a schema to map the myths and symbols associated with nationalism that could reinforce an ethnic identity. So that concept of myths and symbols and rituals and performance related to the people, the homeland, the religion, ethos and history, those aren't specific to any one nation, right? That's a broad schema in order to map and understand the cultural content. That element of work we specifically designed to have cross-temporal and cross-case comparative analysis, right, of the role of nationalism and how it's conceived. So we have always conceived of that as a way in which to undertake comparative understandings of the role of culture in politics. At the same time, we were motivated by specifically tracking ethnic myths and symbols in what are understood to be archetypal civic liberal nations, right? And I think this is part of what Professor Duchesne was hitting on a little bit with us, right? That we're arguing about that a little bit, that's only one element and only one referent of component of identity. And in this case, we found it particularly puzzling to see these forms of nationalism. But the base idea, I think, is to facilitate this kind of comparative analysis across time and across cases, not just in the West. We particularly found this current moment puzzling.
Thanks, Robert. I mean, just to throw in as a chair, what I find interesting about this question is, of course, India we have populism, and it's religious, not ethnic, right? It's multi-ethnic, but based on a religious identity. And of course, the other thing that's interesting to your particular methodology is that there's also a lot of Hindu nationalists who are active on Twitter, right? In ways that are very similar in some ways to the examples that you've used in the book. But I'll stop there. Does anybody else want to respond to that, or should I move on to the next one? Philip?
I'll just make one brief addition, which is that, in this sense, I mean, India is actually an ideal case because it arguably also had a civic national identity that was dominant during the Congress period after independence. So it really would be a perfect case to extend the analysis.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Let's move on to Anna Elizabeth's question. First of all, a statement. Thank you for the wonderful discussion. My question is naturalization more appropriately normalization of different social schisms? For example, both ethnic nationalization and anti-Semitism are harmful but normalized mechanisms of extreme parts of society. They're inevitably immoral to general standards, but are deeply ingrained in society. Isn't the argument of naturalization defeated by that?
Well, I suppose I could maybe quickly just say something. I'm not sure that the fact that something is deeply ingrained in society means that this is a process of naturalization. What I try to explain, I think, what is in the argument of people who believe that it's less a question of cultural and long-standing cultural things. The question is how much others who do not share in this case, ethnic nationalism, but it could be, in Elizabeth, other question, how they are actually helped by others to consolidate their claims and to consolidate their ideas. So the idea of naturalization is that people who actually claim to be, let's say, civic nationalists would actually contribute to help ethnic nationalism to develop. So the idea is that it's not because something has been long-standing and because we observe it again and again that it is actually natural. It is a construction of a long history of political, in this case, national legitimation, and this helps this ethnic nationalism to develop and to win in the end. So this is this idea that if you look only at ethnic nationalism, you cannot see what actually happened is that these people have their claims defended by others who say that they don't want to contribute, but they do contribute because they actually defend the idea of national legitimacy.
Eric, do you want to talk?
Do you want to respond to that?
Eric, do you want to respond to that, or do you want me? Because that's also an important point, I think. I just want to say, Sophie, that I think we fully, actually, largely agree on that point. That it is this dialectic between civic and ethnic nationalism that naturalizes, right, the conception of the nation as the container of this power over time through ideas and institutional carriers and historical contingencies. That is part and parcel of what gives ethnic nationalists their power. Because the concept of the nation is not contested in that regard. It is the container within which this happens. I think part of what we were trying to do in this response to the question a little bit is whether you call it naturalization or normalization, it is this idea that there is a real and an unreal, right, that gets contested over time. And over time, as that's happening, we were particularly interested in looking at particular variants of that manifesting that were using the reference of people, homeland, religion, ethos, and history through a frame of defining those through ethnic criteria. The civic side does the same thing, and it's this dialectic that actually, I think, that's part of what Hutchison, I think, has shown us, gives the nation's power over time, right? This kind of ability to oscillate in these different keys. And we were just simply here trying to say, why is, I think as scholars of nationalism, we look at this and say, of course this is happening. This is not terribly puzzling, but a lot of people think, what is going on? What's happening in our politics? Where did this come from? And part of what we're trying to show is that there has been a recurrent force of this, and it's you only see it as puzzling if you forget the history of this happening over time. So I think we're actually largely agreeing on that dialectic power between these two forces and variants of nationalism. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Just to add to Robert's point, which is more builds on what you were saying, Rob and Sophie, but maybe less to what the question was, but to say that, you know, in our most recent work, it's what we've tried to do really is also show how the so-called civic nationalist tradition is a nationalist tradition, which many people, particularly in the US, forget. And they just associate nationalism with the right, with right-wing populists, for example. And in a recent analysis that we did of the Biden and Trump campaigns in 2020, we actually find that Biden is the more nationalist figure, in the sense that he much more intensively draws on established myths about America and what America is and what America's boundaries are. They're just different myths, but they're still nationalists in the sense that the nation itself is uncontested. So we're building on Rob and largely agreeing with Professor Duchesne there. So.
Great, thank you, Eric. I'm going to turn to, I think we'll have time for one last question. This is from Miriam, who writes, from the communication lens and through your study of individual tweets, I wonder if you could talk a bit about the impact of the new media and the influence of communication staffers in this development of nationalism.
I'll go first on that, but I'm sure people may have views of this. So Eric and I, we had played with the title of this book a lot, right? And one of them was, it's not Twitter's fault. So we're pretty strongly in the camp of that. The issue here that people argue, you know, we started writing this book and saying, we're going to look at tweets and nationalism, people saying, oh yeah, it's so bad. Social media is causing all these issues. And it certainly is. There's a lot of research on how social media as a medium structures communication, particularly around populism and nationalism and affinity between them. But part of our undercurrent of argument in this book is it's not the medium. So it's not the social media staffers. It's not the politics of campaigning. There's some elements that are particularly novel about it, and we can get into that, but they're lower key. The issue is the message. It's not how things are being communicated or engaged with, it's what people are saying. And we firmly place ourselves in that kind of perspective, that yes, there is a lot of ecosystem around social media, and yes, it does create a polarized politics, and yes, it creates filter bubbles and anonymity, which reinforce extremism, and that is very serious issues. But in explaining why it's particularly ethnic nationalism that's actually been successful, it's not because of social media, and it's not because of particular staffers or because Trump had a particularly good staffer who was good at, you know, we went quite deep into researching how Trump went about doing his tweets, same for Le Pen and same for the Leave campaigners. And it's not the political communication staff or the medium. That all matters, and we actually pay quite a bit of attention to it. But our argument is it's the message that's really reverberating here, right? And, you know, some of Professor Miller-Idriss's work on extremism here and online spaces could probably add some context to what I'm saying, but that's our basic position. Like in the Marshall McLuhan, it's not the medium, it's the message. That's kind of part and parcel of our argument is.
Anybody else like to take on that? Okay. I want to make sure that everyone's had a chance to respond. Does any of the first three discussants want to respond to the comments from Robert and Eric before we conclude? I want to make sure there's a chance for response from any of the three of you.
Maybe I would just say that I appreciate the comments back, and in a way it's a little unfair to expect, you know, somebody to write the book you would want them to write, not focus on the variables you want them to focus on. So I appreciate it, and think there's lots of room for further discussion on it as we move forward. So thanks very much.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I think we've come to the end of an hour and a half, and I want to thank again the three discussants, Philip, Cynthia, and Sophie, and then of course the co-authors of the book, Robert and Eric, for not only arranging this and writing an interesting book, but also the responses to the discussants' comments, and to the, of course, to the participants for their good questions and for sparking off a good discussion. So thanks to everybody again. Like I mentioned, please do look at the ASEN website and the LSE Ideas website. Our next ASEN event will be in a week's time with Michael Hector. But it now just remains for me to thank everybody for participating and thank our 5 participants on the panel. And thanks to everybody for such an interesting discussion.
I also want to express my thanks to the discussants again and say that I hope at some point I can see all of you in person and thank you in person and take you out for a meal or something, because I really appreciate your time. It's just wonderful. So thank you.
Ditto.
Great. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.